Hi, Ellie. Good morning, and thank you for agreeing to be part of our ASAA oral history project, celebrating 50 years of Asian studies, or the ASAA in Australia. As I mentioned to you, and as we've spoken about before, our goal is to try to really get a good sense of the people who make up the association or make up the field of Asian studies in Australia in all its wonderful diversity. And so we're really glad that you could join us today. Just to start off, I wonder if you could, for the benefit of people who are watching this episode, if you could tell us very briefly about yourself. If you could introduce yourself, tell us what you're doing at the moment, and maybe talk about what you see as your expertise.
Sure. Thanks, David. And thanks again for the invitation to join this series. What a great initiative and happy anniversary to the ASAA. So hi everybody, I'm Eleanor Williams, but please call me Ellie. So I'm currently based in Jakarta. I've been living in Indonesia on and off really for the past 20 years or so, between Jogja, Jakarta. And at the moment I'm working as an advisor for the Australia Awards Indonesia program, the scholarship program funded by the Australian government, which sends masters and PhD students to Australia to study. So this is fresh off the back of finishing my PhD last year and graduating earlier this year at the ANU. So my PhD was looking at the impact of Australian students studying in Indonesia through the new Colombo Plan or the NCP initiative and through Achici's Study Indonesia program as well. So I've been in this role now as an advisor in public diplomacy and alumni engagement with Australia Awards for about 6 months. That's flown. But I'm also working remotely with Lee Tran, Professor Lee Tran from Deakin University,
Nice.
on her work, which is actually an extension of the previous project she did on New Colombo Plan research. And this is looking now at kind of barriers, geopolitical barriers to students taking up placements in the NCP. So still very much trying to keep a foot in the research world and also in the sort of practitioner world as well.
Great, thank you. I didn't know about your connection with Lee Strand at Deakin, but
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
that's a good one to have too. Um,
Mm.
so in your in your training to date and your as a practitioner, uh, I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about sort of maybe how the path you've trodden so far, and whether or not the term Asianist means something to you, or what does it mean to you?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about that before when you sent the invitation, I was like, what does that term mean? Or Indonesianist, in our kind of little
Mm.
hatch as well. Look, for me, I think as many others in the field are grappling with this as well, I find it a bit of a loaded term. It almost feels a little bit, maybe dare I say, dated to me. I don't know. I think in my mind, when I was studying Indonesian, so I came up, maybe I'll go back a bit before I answer this.
Mhm.
So I was very fortunate to grow up in some of my formative years in Darwin, which has a really strong Indonesian community back then and as it does today. And we were really lucky. We learned Indonesian at primary school. We had a very strong Indonesian community around us. We had family friends who were Indonesian. And even though this was very formative, names, numbers, colors, those sorts of words, but very formative as part of the kind of this is the world we are living in and operating in. And I think, as a child, I was very young. I was like 4 to 8 in Darwin. Some of those really early formative memories were made there in a sense of this is what Australia is, this very
Mm.
early sense of, well, this is where we live, this is our neighbours, and being in Darwin especially. Um, but then we moved to Sydney, and for my last couple of years of primary school, they didn't have Indonesian, so I didn't keep going with it. But then when I started in high school, till year 10, and then we moved back to Adelaide, my family moved around a lot. But I was able to keep going with Indonesian at both of those high schools. And so keeping going with that, and then keeping going with it when I got to university as well, at UTS for my undergrad in international studies and writing. They didn't have Indonesian, but they did have international studies. So I did my Indonesian at Sydney Uni in a cross-institutional arrangement, and then kept going with honours. But through all of these years, what I think what I'm getting at, through all of these years, you're reading these kind of seminal texts. You're being taught by mostly Australians who could speak Indonesian or who'd done a lot of research on it. And very much that term Indonesianist or Asianist was applied back then and was very, that was the image that we had, I think, as students in our mind of it's your lecturer, it's your Indonesian teacher, it's someone who spent a lot of time there, they've written a lot of books about it, they're fluent in the language. And that's amazing. But then, of course, as time has gone on, and I've actually really started to reflect on this, particularly through my own PhD recently, through my work with the ASAA as the postgrad rep for a couple of years there. But thinking through, now, of course, through Australia Awards, the number of Indonesian scholars who are studying in Australia, the number of other scholars
Mm.
from, even in the Pacific, the PNG, and around as well, we have high numbers of Australia Awards scholars coming to Australia from those countries as well. But even just thinking through this idea of who gets to be an Asianist, who gets to be an Indonesianist, who gets to hold that expertise,
Mm.
who gets to hold that label. And I think it's something that I reflect on a lot up here, of course, being in Jakarta and being, even in Indonesia more broadly over 20 years or so. Who gets to be called an expat? And that horrible word,
Indeed, yes.
all of those questions, right? So for me, it's kind of in the same camp. And I don't mean to dismiss the many, many decades of expertise that have been built up and that have kind of created that label. But I do think we need to be careful about who we apply it to. And are we simply talking about, well, this is for an Australian scholar or an overseas scholar of that place who then travels to that place and learns all about it. Again, did a lot of thinking about this through a PhD in anthropology at the ANU. Who gets to be called those labels? Who gets to be called an Indonesianist, an Asianist, an anthropologist, a researcher? When, of course, as we know, it's the people who are on the ground who hold those stories, who hold a lot of that knowledge as well. So I don't want to dismiss it. I think it's more simply a label or a term that I struggle with. I mean, people have called me an Indonesianist before or an Asianist
Mm.
academic. And, on one hand, it's incredibly flattering. But on the other hand, it's something that I wouldn't readily use to describe myself, I think.
Yes, no, it carries a lot of weight, doesn't it? I mean,
It does.
to claim expertise in a very
Yeah.
large and complex country for a start. So then, if I could just push back there. So then, if you were to gently or not refute or to reject that term, what would you replace it with? Or are you still thinking about
I was going to say, I've opened a can of worms, haven't I? I knew you were going to ask me that.
that one?
Well, look, I think probably more broadly, for me personally, I would describe myself as a researcher practitioner anyway. So very much, sort of having, as I said earlier, one foot in each camp, wanting to
Yeah.
work both within academia, with academic colleagues, working on research projects with an Indonesian focus and a Southeast Asian focus, but also working with policymakers, working with university policymakers, government policymakers, and so on, to very much kind of have, I suppose, be working in both of those camps. Yeah, so it's not a
Yeah.
nice label, but researcher practitioner is probably how I would self-identify.
Yeah, no, no. Look, I completely take your point. I don't want us to derail our conversation, but I sort of struggle with the same thing. I sort of in my field,
Mm,
and it's also there's a pressure for neat and simple labeling sometimes, but
yeah,
the sometimes the term we light upon is not necessarily the best one, and
yeah.
it sort of raises as many questions as it answers. So I
Mm,
think you've actually raised a great point there. Um, I do have a question we've sort of been asking people in this series. In a way, you've answered it or to some degree already, but I'll pitch it to you anyway. And so if you want to sort of add something or sort of
yeah.
elaborate on what you've said, please do so. Which is to sort of say, well, what's your origin story? Sort of
Mm,
in Asian studies and how, when, why to begin. You mentioned, for instance, the growing up in Darwin. I mean, that's obviously going to be part of it. But is there anything else you would add, or would you like to elaborate? I suppose in answering that question.
yeah, yeah, thank you. I know, sorry, I kind of got a bit carried away with that
No,
answer
no, no.
before.
It's wonderful.
Um, But yes, certainly Darwin was for me was absolutely the genesis. And I remember moving, as I said, to Sydney when I was started year four in Sydney. And I just remember my school feeling so different, so white, so this is 1992 as well. So it was a very different area. It was a very, Darwin is a melting pot of everything, Indigenous Australian culture, Southeast Asian culture in Australia, Chinese origins that are there in Darwin as well. So, to have all of that just in such a small space as it is in Darwin, and then to go to somewhere vastly different, in Sydney, it was really, it was a shock. It's like a kind of, but this is my version of what Australia is, and then to go to somewhere so different was like, where am I? What is this? So yeah, that was a bit of a shock. But for me, yeah, so it started with Darwin, and then I think those couple of years, not quite learning language or speaking it or being around it. So then it was a godsend when I got to high school, and they did, thankfully, here we are about, languages policy in the 90s, but they did still have Indonesian at school. I was very lucky. So we actually had, in year seven at the time, we had to do a term each of German, French, and then Indonesian, and then we would choose the one we wanted to go on with. Um, I was terrible at German. French, I don't think I liked my teacher or something. So teachers do make a difference, as we know.
Hmm.
But Indonesian, of course, the big selling factor for me, I mean, apart from, having heard it, grown up with it, been around it, loved it, enjoyed it. But of course, the big selling factor for me was that we got to go on a trip in year 10. So I was like, yep, I'll do Indonesian. I'll get a trip out of it. This will be fantastic. I'll set myself up. But look, so to answer your question, really was around language. Language was my
Mm.
absolutely my entry point into Indonesian research, into wanting to carve out a career up here. Later on going to work in development studies and so on. Um, but looking at that, the great irony in all of that was that, of course, by the time of year 10, that happened to be 1998, um, everything was just going awry in Indonesia, and we didn't get a
Mm.
trip at
Mm.
all. So it was
Mm.
lucky
It
that I loved
was.
it anyway and kept going with it till, year 12 and on to university. But yeah, very much for me, it was the language. Language was, it was fun. It was this, it was 3 days a week. I think we had three classes a week from memory. And we had, of course, one of those incredible Indonesian teachers who has set up the classroom with all sorts of bits and pieces from around the archipelago.
Mm.
Somehow, I've yet to know how they got this through customs, but somehow our Indonesian classroom had a becak in it, so a rickshaw. Um, I
Great.
mean, it was fun, right? You're 12 years old, and this opens your mind to a completely different world. We had classes on orangutans, and you're learning key vocab, but you're also understanding what's actually happening on the ground. And so I mean, I say this kind of half jokingly, but we're constantly now grappling with how do we get students interested in Indonesian? And I reflect back to some of those early things for me personally. And when we start hearing responses from government now about, well, tell them about the booming tech industry and AI and the game,
Mm. Mm.
like, I don't know that year seven and eights want to know about that or that they care
No.
about that. But put a betchuck in their classroom and maybe they're a bit more interested. I don't know. That probably sounds terribly dated.
Uh, I think you've no, I think you've got a very good point there. It's got to be something tangible, some form, and as you say, it's something other than booming economies. It's sort of
Yeah,
it's a little bit too soon, I think,
correct.
for that
Correct.
line of selling. Um, Obviously, there's more I'd like to ask, but can I just before we move past the memory, I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the rest of your class. So you said you're doing
Mm,
Indonesian with some of
mm.
your classmates. Were you one of the few in that cohort who had some prior knowledge of Indonesian? What was sort of what was the lay of the land sort of within your
Yeah.
school year?
I, I remember that I should also add that my high school was very different culturally, linguistically compared to my primary school. So when I got to high school, it was much more diverse, thank goodness. Um, but I think we had one or two heritage learners. So one or both of their parents were from Indonesia. So they sort of had a bit of a head start, but not much in terms of like formal, they'd grown up speaking it or hearing it, but they'd never written it or read and so on. So in that sense, they were kind of on the same page as us. Um, I don't recall, I think this is a while ago, so I don't quite recall. other people growing up with it. I think, in fact, at the primary school of my high school, because it continued, they had taught it briefly, perhaps at year 5 or 6, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So I think there may have been some continuing students, but again, it was numbers, colors, very, very basic sort of stuff. So when we sort of picked it
Mm.
up in year 7, it was kind of trying to bring everyone together on the same page with, topics, weather, colors, alphabet, sounds, things like that. So it was very, very basic. There was no sense in those early classes of differential kind of playing field or anything like that. It was a bit different once I got to university, of course, and we had heritage speakers again, but much more advanced. They'd done a different stream in year 12 Indonesian as heritage
Mm.
speakers, things like that. So that was a little bit different, and they had different classes, different units, and so on. But apart from that, in high school, it felt pretty much like an equal playing field, if you will.
And what of the teacher? I mean, could you tell us a little bit about your? I mean, clearly had invested quite heavily, or
Yeah,
in
yeah.
the setup and thinking about what might appeal to 12 to 15 year
Yeah.
olds, whatever it might be.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. It's so funny you say that because I recently reconnected with my year 8, year 9, I think she was, Indonesian teacher. So, through some of the work that I've been doing in the last few years as a board member with the Australia Indonesia Institute, one of the programs that we support is NILA, so the National Australia Indonesia Language Awards. Now, NILA is a great initiative because it's essentially the idea is about, rewarding students and teachers for language learning. So language learning, language teaching, taking initiatives. And it's great because we have, you start from a primary level and you go all the way up to a professional level. And then in the AII, we also award teachers who are teaching these students. And so it kind of becomes this full cycle of, rewarding these students and their teachers who are teaching them um, for giving back and actually, the work that they put in. As we all know, language teachers are so unrecognized. So, a few years ago through COVID, we wanted to work out a way of being able to kind of reward these teachers and to make it part of that ecosystem of NILA that already exists. Anyways, through all of that, a couple of years ago, I reconnected with my old Indonesian teacher who was sending all of her students through NILA and they kept winning. And I was like, who is their Indonesian teacher at
mm.
this school? And it was Ibu Jo from, my school back in the day. And it was just so lovely to be reconnected. And we've stayed in touch. And then also recently at Australia Awards, we've launched the Indonesian Language Learning Ambassadors Program, ILA, which basically places Indonesian scholars who are currently doing their master's or PhD in Australia. It places them in some of these schools in Australia teaching Indonesian, so essentially as volunteer language teachers and so on. And so Ibu
Mm.
Jo reached out and wanted to get a student or two in her classroom. And so, these sort of connections. I mean, I don't know whether this is particularly unique to Indonesian teaching in Australia. Like, I don't know if this is the same in Korean studies or in Chinese studies or other languages. But, the Indonesia-Australia community is very small and sometimes, pros and cons. But one of the definite pros of that is these kind of ongoing connections. But yeah, so that was Ibu Jo. But I actually had three at that school. We had Bu Artap. Bless. I will never forget the word for Kalinchi. She pulled a rabbit out of her hat and yelled the word, and I've never forgotten Kalinchi ever since. I had then Ibu Jo, and then I had Ibu Brown just for one semester before I moved to one term before I moved to Adelaide. And then in Adelaide, I had Ibu Chini, Carolyn Chinchala. So, some amazing teachers who were very, very passionate about it. Um, and again, like some of the things, I mean, I know when I was thinking about your questions on the list and like early encounters, some of the things that stay with me, and again, why I think we need to be thinking about these now with students, it was the gamelan incursion or the dance incursion. It was going to an Indonesian restaurant, in year 11 or year 12 in Adelaide and being only allowed to use Indonesian with the wait staff and have to order
Mm.
everything. We were terrified. We were like, we've got this, limited
Remember that?
vocab.
Yes, yes,
But
yes.
it was such a great exercise in just forcing us out of our comfort zone while still obviously being very much in a comfort zone of, you're in a restaurant,
Mm.
you're in Adelaide and so on. But yeah, so some of the things that they did, just going, I guess, beyond the textbooks, beyond the tapes and the videos that we had, and really trying to make that classroom and that sense of Indonesia come alive. And, things like watching, when, as I said before, 98, we were watching the fall of Suharto on TVRI News, on SBS Live in our classroom. I very vividly remember that. In year 10 Indonesian one day, sitting there watching this live. It's like,
Mm.
what are we watching? Very young, but
Mm,
just this profound sense of this is huge.
that's amazing to think through. Yes, I didn't connect that when you were talking about the dates, but you're right. I mean, it
Yeah.
was history is in front of your face.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've also like to ask people about some of their writing and their research,
Mm,
and I guess in your case, so recently having completed your PhD, uh,
mm.
you have again already sort of given us a little bit of a taste of that, but here's an opportunity to tell us some more, or about uh, any other sort of opportunities you've had to publish from your research.
Yeah, thanks. So I suppose that's the most significant piece of writing to come out of my research so far. But yeah, so in my PhD, I was, as I said, looking at the impact of Australian government-funded scholarship programs like the New Colombo Plan on Australia-Indonesia relationship building. And I guess I looked at this for a number of reasons. Um, I had worked for a long time, firstly going back sort of gender development, was working for the UN, was working for Oxfam, all in Indonesia. But I'd been able to do that because of the year that I had with Achichis, so the Australian Consortium for In-Country Indonesian Studies, just Achichis now. The year that I had with them in 2005, studying in Yogyakarta at Gadjah Mada University, and what that opened up for me. So the research opportunities, the way that I was able to meet people and interview people and gain that very formative kind of research experience, which I just loved. So then I went on and did sort of development stuff and gender and worked in different projects. But it was always kind of two camps for me. I was always fascinated by, I suppose the education elements of how do we, how do Australians, as students, how do we understand Indonesia? How can we contribute to deepening that understanding for students and wanting to give back really to the organization that had enabled that for me? And then sort of gender and development over on this side. So I was working at the time in the UN, and then this opportunity came up to take on the resident director role for Achichis, which I got and I loved, and it was one of those kind of just phenomenal roles that you'll forever be grateful for in your career, that you pinch yourself that you get to do it. It was an amazing job, but it was also, I started that in the middle of 2013, and at the end of 2013, beginning of 2014, the federal government launched the New Colombo Plan, or started talking about the New Colombo Plan, and it would launch throughout 2014. And so what this was, I mean, it's pretty well versed now, but for people who still who don't know about the NCP, this was essentially a scholarship that had never been done before through sort of two streams. The first was really to as a scholarship scheme, so 12 months to 18 months, pots of money directly paid to students to go and study in 40 countries across the Indo-Pacific, Indonesia being one of the top five in its first, pilot year. And then the other pot of money was sort of grants to universities to send groups of students up on kind of faculty-led tours, a 2-week study tour, and 8-week thing, a semester-long thing, and so on. But that was paid to universities. So in these sort of two streams, that was happening. So Achichis was very fortunate throughout the whole course of the NCP. And we started seeing an increase, a significant increase in the number of students that were coming up to study in Indonesia. And this was not only what I really enjoyed watching in all of that time was that this was not only students of Indonesian studies or who, like I had previously, been learning the language, been interested in politics and Indonesian culture and so on. This was students from nursing, midwifery, public
Mm.
health, accounting, business, agriculture, sustainable tourism, development studies, journalism. So as a result, all of the Teachers program offerings, we started to diversify, to cater to that, to these very different cohorts of students that were coming up. But of course, this starts going on, and our numbers went from, something like 60 odd students each year in my first year as resident director to 150, 200, 300 to 500 or so before the pandemic. And, this is like significant exponential growth year on year. But one thing that kept coming up throughout that period was what kind of an impact is this having on these Indonesian communities that are hosting them? There's a lot of literature coming out at the time in international education, of course, in the DFAT evaluations about the students' perspective, what they were gaining from it. There's a lot of literature in international education about learning abroad as being incredibly transformational. But I kept hearing stories from host communities or from, accommodation hosts, for example, or internship hosts who might be welcoming these students into their communities, and suddenly they wake up and they're like, oh, we've never had an Australian, and now suddenly we've got 20 students living on my street. What is going on here? And for good and bad, some had very positive experiences and some had less than positive experiences. So I was kind of, just filing all of this away in the very, very busy period of expanding, working with the Chi-Chis and the NCP in those years. But it was very much like I always knew that I wanted to do a PhD. I just wasn't entirely sure on what. So I kind of filed these away, filed these thoughts away, like always with this question of why don't we know what the host communities think about it?
Mm,
I mean,
mm,
ostensibly, this was a program that has been put out through and funded through DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and not through the Department of Education. So this is obviously a key initiative in public diplomacy and in soft power. Shouldn't we care what the Indonesians actually think about this? So it really struck me as this kind of gap in our understanding of not knowing
mm.
what the Indonesians really think of these kind of growing numbers of Australian students. So again, I filed that away and then kind of eventually, went back to Australia, was working in Melbourne for a little bit, and then the time was right. I was like, right, I'm ready to start the PhD, moved up to ANU to do it at the start of 2020. Good timing. 6 weeks later, the world's in lockdown.
Mm,
Um, but the question had remained and had really stayed with me all those years. Like it's one thing to understand this idea of, transformation of a student's self and potential transformation of the relationship. But does this also apply to Indonesian communities hosting these students, to their sense of an Australia-Indonesia relationship? So that was kind of what I took into that and yeah, was researching through the pandemic, which was a challenge in itself, but you get through it. And really to understand this idea of, well, how does it also impact, if at all, and in what ways, Indonesian communities, just as it impacts Australian students? So yeah, that was my PhD.
and so, what did you find?
Yeah,
Then that's a completely compelling sort of
yeah,
rationale there, I must say.
yeah.
But so, I'd love to find out what did you find?
Well, it was really interesting. Some of I think at the beginning, so I should also add to start with this. So because of COVID, I couldn't come up and do my fieldwork in person. So one of the kind of the workarounds through that was instead of coming up to Indonesia and following a group of students around and their host communities in country at the time, because I couldn't, I pivoted to become an alumni study. So I looked at students who'd studied through, say, 2014 to 2019, the first 5 years of the NCP, and their associated communities that they volunteered with,
Mhm.
interned with, lived with, studied with, and so on. So I did the Australian bits where I could in person and on Zoom. And then I worked with a group of co-researchers who had also previously worked with the Chi-Chis and had research expertise and experience, but like me, had also left the Chi-Chis. And so, they had that kind of critical distance as well that they could be working with. So the questions that they would then put, we designed all the questions together and then they would put them to the group in Jogjakarta, Bandung, and Jakarta. I had 3 sites, which were the kind of host communities where they received the greatest number of Achichi students at that time. And some of the things that came out like really just blew our minds, like things I was not expecting to hear. So as I said before, they were positive, they were negative. I think at the beginning when each discussion started, it was always, oh, it was wonderful. It was so great to meet these Australian students, very polished, polite, lovely answers. And then of course you dig a bit deeper and I've said before to colleagues in Achichis, it's not that it was necessarily overtly critical per se of like
Mm,
they were, a bunch of ratbag students or they were, it wasn't anything like that. It was more a reflection on the position, like, for example, the position of local staff working in universities, what they thought they could offer to Australian students. So I'll give you an example. In one of the focus groups we ran in Bandung in West Java, we spoke with staff from their university international office who at the time were responsible for, arranging Achichi students' visas, their police permits when they arrived, their enrollment, all of those sorts of administrative tasks. And one of them said to us, I very much thought that they were going to be better than us in the sense of their language is more advanced. I'm going to be making mistakes with my English. I'm going to look like an idiot, and so on and so on. And actually, I stopped and realized no, there's things that I can offer here that they don't even understand how to do, and not as a criticism, but just as a fact.
mm, mm,
Understanding local hierarchies, understanding how to address a lecturer or a police officer or an immigration officer, and then how to order something in a restaurant. And the students, of course, had no idea yet about these levels of hierarchy in Sundanese or Javanese relationships, and they were still learning those. So the very fact that someone had this kind of cultural competency and this cultural nous that they've grown up with, and they know how to just instantly code switch between registers and between levels of hierarchy and power dynamics. Suddenly they realized this was something I could offer that I didn't even realize was a skill. That was
mm,
one thing. Another thing we heard repeatedly across all groups was the different I guess the differences in identity, ethnicity, culture, and race. So I would ask a question at the beginning, before you met an Australian, what did you think an Australian or an Australia was? And
mm,
I asked the same question to Australians going to Indonesia. What did you think Indonesians were, and so on? And then after you'd hosted, after you'd hung out with each other, had that changed or was it the same? And of course, every time it had changed. And the Indonesians would say things like, oh, I thought that they would all be white, speak English, they'd all be Christian, they'd all be this, this, this. And oh,
mm,
we hosted students who had Bangladeshi heritage. We hosted students who had, Chinese heritage, who were Muslim, who had Filipino parents or whatever. We hosted students who had Indonesian parents and who've been coming here their whole lives. Or I learned that in Australia, there's mosques, there's this, so suddenly opening their eyes to the diversity of Australia's multiculturalism, the breadth of that through this, and particularly I think through a increasingly diverse Australian student body that is traveling as well through learning abroad programs. For them, this was also incredibly like, what is this nearest neighbor that is so
mm,
completely different to what I had expected and what I had thought? So there was a lot of sort of expectation shattering that happened, which I loved hearing about, because
mm,
it's precisely the point of learning abroad programs, not only for the Australians who equally were having similarly kind of mind-shattering experiences of, I thought everyone was going to be speaking Indonesian in lectures, and then I get there and it's all Javanese and I can't
mm,
follow a single word. Um, they each had these experiences, and not to, I think on one level there's a sort of, this is kind of fun and we can look at this as a superficial kind of experience of an encounter. But looking more deeply, what this actually says about, as when one participant put it, she said, I felt like I had a very deeply internalized, colonialized mindset. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And it was all of that stuff around power hierarchies and what does it mean to be welcoming a
mm,
Malay, like a foreigner, on campus. We've always had this expectation that we have to have this kind of reverence of these international students and they're going to be better than us. And I had to really take myself to
mm,
task on that. This is what she was saying. I had to really question my thinking on that because it simply wasn't true. And we had so much to offer them that I had never considered was actually culturally valuable. So yeah, I think then through the lens of kind of encounters in my thesis, I kind of unpacked this a lot. Looking at affect theory, looking at this through an anthropological lens of what actually happens when these stereotypes are shattered and when people bump up against each other and they question these kind of
mm,
preconceived ideas of what is an Australian, what is an Indonesian, what does it mean for us to be foreign to someone else
mm.
or different to someone else, but actually have a lot of things in common.
Yeah, no, I know that's absolutely fascinating. And as I said, at the one thing I sort of hear in that when I listen to that account is that it's not necessarily it sort of moves the discussion away from a good and bad. I like that
Yeah.
person, I don't like. It's more that I just have a somewhat better understanding of them now, and can see some of the moral complexity. But that is a massive gain.
Yeah.
There's a lot to be said for that. And you're not going to like everything you find out about someone that you didn't know before, but there's it's still a deeper knowledge, and there's huge value in that
Yeah.
for both sides, I guess. Yeah,
Exactly. And I think I would just
yeah,
add to that as well that another thing that really came out quite strongly was this feeling among some, not all, but some host communities who said, they just felt like they really hadn't been included in the decision making. And so
mm, mm,
of
mm,
the new Colombo Plan, but of learning abroad policies more generally. And so to hear for them, they would say to me things like, "Oh, this is the first time anyone's asked my opinion about this. This is the first time I've been
mm,
invited to a focus group about this," or "Oh, yeah, we got a survey, but I don't know whatever happened to the results of that," and so on. So that feeling of if we talk about, particularly again, being up here in Indonesia and in development studies for so long and working with DFAT as well, and you hear a lot about locally led development and engaging with partner organizations, engaging with Indonesian organizations. What does that mean in practice? What does that actually mean to involve host communities in learning abroad, policy setting, in planning? And I think that's what I mean before when I was saying it's research, but it's also policy. So you can take this as a researcher, you can hear these stories, but then for me, it's always a question of, well, what do you do with it then? Okay, so I then want to say, well, okay, how can this message get across to university policymakers? How can this get across to, the NCP Secretariat at DFAT? How can we be changing some of this narrative of saying, well, if we really want to include Indonesian communities, Singaporean communities, Malaysian communities, all the different host communities that are making the NCP a success,
Mm,
we not only need to be sort of paying lip service to this idea of, oh yes, locally led development or locally led, partnerships in general, that word, in fact.
mm, mm,
But
mm.
actually, what does a good, equal, equitable partnership look like in learning abroad? So yeah, reflecting on some of that, I think then being able to say, well, let's take that back to government and feed some of that into their roundtables and their discussions. And that's what I hoped to be able to do with my PhD. And it has since been sort of, taken that to DFAT. I've had conversations with colleagues there. So it's been good to be able to do that. And I don't know, again, we don't know if that will have an impact, but I hope so.
I'm really glad to hear you say that you've had some opportunities to feed it, probably to where it needs to be reached, as you say. If DFAT is well, at least having a big part in the rollout of NCP, then it's I'm sure they'll be benefiting from your findings there. So thank you for doing that work for us.
Oh, fingers
Um,
crossed.
yes. Uh, so another point we like to ask people too is, I suppose, is their involvement in ASAA, either as a conference goer or as an office holder. And you did allude to your time as the postgrad rep, but yeah, tell us about that part of your life.
Yeah, yeah, that's lovely. Thank you. So I think first of all, it goes back many, many years to, being at uni and undergrad student and always hearing about it from our lecturers, Barbara Lee at UTS, Keith Fulcher at Sydney,
Mm.
um, Michelle Ford, later Adrian Vickers, very much in the Sydney world, Ibu Nofi. Um, and these were obviously conferences you'd go to, and but also the Indonesia Council conference every couple of years, the ICOC, as a kind of subcommittee from the ASAA,
Hmm.
particularly because we were students and it was free, so that's always nice. But very much from an early age, academically being encouraged to go to these conferences, to, the student membership was affordable, to be immersed in the current research and beyond, also beyond your field of just Indonesian or anthropology or political science, and seeing what's actually happening from an area studies perspective to gain that kind of comparative perspective as well, which I've always been really grateful for. Because you can get into a little bit of a bubble, I think, in Indonesian studies. So being able to look out a bit more and see what's actually happening, yeah, in Korea, and what's happening in Japan, what's happening as comparative examples in Vietnam and mainland Southeast Asia, and so on. So it was always really useful as a student and enlightening as a student to see and hear those different perspectives. And then, of course, the research alone. So all the many reports that ASAA would put out, particularly on Asian language and literacy, using those in my own research, of course. But, building up that network as well through many years of going to the conferences and so on. And then, yeah, the opportunity came up when I was doing my PhD to take up the role of the postgrad representative. And I think I may have even just like leapt at the opportunity and said, yes, of course. Because again, it was this chance to give back to an organization that has given so much to all of us as students, as researchers, as academics, as practitioners. And to do that in a way, particularly it was through COVID. So the entire time, this was in 2020 and all of 21. So it was all online. So there was a lot of, I think for many, I remember at the time, for many of us in that postgrad group, we were feeling so depressed and isolated,
Mm.
and all of our fieldwork plans had been dashed. None of us knew if we could keep going with our projects, particularly, my colleagues in anthropology, who were so
Mm.
dependent on fieldwork. Suddenly not being able to do those projects. As I said, I was lucky because I could pivot mine to do stuff online or to work with alumni in Australia. But, others who were going to do, say, a 15-month ethnography of a village in Thailand or Burma or something just couldn't. And then other
Mm.
complications. happened with those projects. But, these sorts of things were happening. So we sort of banded together and said, well, what can we do that's online that connects us from all different corners of the country and the region? And what came out of that was actually really wonderful. It was a sense of we started doing sort of brown bag lunches every couple of months. We would invite guest speakers to come and share their research learnings, who were members of ASAA, who would come and say, what they like as researchers, how could they kind of give us their tips and tricks as researchers on Indonesia or on Korea or on Vietnam or whatever their specialization was, or taking a discipline focus. So as anthropologists or as I think we had human geographers in there, came and spoke as well, political scientists and so on. So having those different perspectives while we were sort of sitting there going, we don't even know if we can keep going with our PhDs, it really gave us, I think, a lot of motivation. And I was very grateful. I think we were all very grateful at the time to ASAA for coordinating that, for, so many members being so responsive and, just, yep, we're happy to speak at that. We're happy to help. It really felt like we were part of a network, and it really felt like the ASAA was supporting us. So again, thank you to ASAA during that time. I did put this in my thesis acknowledgements because it really meant a lot to all of us. But yeah, just to say thank you again to all of those academics at the time who said yes to a speaker invitation and came along and spoke to our postgrad network. But I think, even beyond that, we had a sort of, I think it was every fortnight or once a month, and I think they've continued them now as well online. But it was a sense of, coming together and connecting across disciplines, across cities, all of it, to feel like you're not alone. There are other people researching Asia, there are other people who are facing these difficulties, and just to get together and to share sort of learnings, challenges, etc. And then, of course, finally being able to actually connect in person. In 2022 at the Monash ASAA conference when it was held down there was wonderful. Being able to actually see all these people who'd been online in little, square boxes for so long. That was really wonderful. And again, just to feel like we had that support of not only ASAA, but also, the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre was there, Indonesia Council, all the other sub-councils as well. It's a really wonderful community, and I'm very, very grateful for it through my time as a researcher and as a postgrad. So yeah, that feeling of, again, being able to give something back as postgrad rep for a couple of years was wonderful.
Yes, you've actually just reminded me too that you refer to yourself as the postgrad rep in the singular, but of course the job has got so big that it now takes two people to do it. So I guess you've got a
That's
bit
right. Yeah.
got a bit to answer for on that front, Ellie, as well. But
Not at all. I think everyone just had so many ideas. Like, oh, we need a few more people.
they do. No, I think it's a great model to share the task as well.
Yeah.
Um, Coming towards the end, I suppose. Another question we like to ask people is as difficult as it can be, but to sort of give us a bit of an assessment of how you sort of see the state of the field and Asian studies, but despite all the
Yeah.
points we raised earlier about, I suppose, the terminology and
Yes.
but just sort of if your sense about the lay of the land, I suppose, and
Yeah.
what sort of changes you've seen in during the time you've been involved.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's like Asian studies, Indonesian studies is still enormously important. And you look at it in Australia in particular, we have decades of expertise now. We have built up this absolute wealth of expertise in Asian studies, and we should be so proud of that. It's a treasure trove that other countries just don't have. Like you see it, of course, overseas. There are in the States and in the Netherlands, of course, there are different types of expertise. There are different scholars over there. There are different experts as well. But what we have in Australia is unique, I think, particularly because of our geographical positioning, our proximity to Asia, as I said before, the diversity of our population with, so many Indonesians, Chinese people, Vietnamese people, the multiculturalism of Australia. I think Penny Wong even in, last year when she was addressing ANU at the time said, it's in our DNA. And it very much
Mm.
is. So for us to be the kind of world leading expert in Asian studies, to me, it's not only a source of pride, but it's something that just makes sense. So that's the first thing I would say on that. But the second thing really is when you look at the kind of the crisis that we're facing at the moment, particularly with regards to languages, but the university funding cuts, the language cuts and so on. This is something that, we really have to defend, and we have to take up the lobbying work. And I think about people who, academics who kind of have gone before my generation and how tired they must be of constantly having to fight this battle, the kind of Greg Feely's and the David Hills and Keith Fulchers, these people who are that, my lecturers and my supervisors and my former bosses,
Mm,
and they've been fighting the good fight for so many years. How tired they must be having to do this work. But, we need to keep doing this work. We need to keep fighting this fight because it is a good fight. And it's also not the kind of thing that I think as recent decades, successive governments have shown us, they're not simply going to wake up one day and say, this is a good thing to fund. We're just going to fund this,
mm.
So apparently we need to keep showing them the value and the worth of fighting for this and advocating for this. And I think the good thing about that is, as I said, we've got lots of expertise, there's plenty of proof of the worth of it, but there's also lots of fantastic organizations, including the ASAA. But also I'm thinking of, ACHICHI is the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre, the Indonesia Council, all the other sub-regional councils. LCNAU, the language, I always get the acronym wrong. So the Languages and
Yes.
Cultures Network of Australian Universities.
Well
Um,
done.
all of the great advocacy work that these groups are doing, NILA that I mentioned before, the Australian
Mm.
Indonesian Youth Association, and all the other different youth groups as well that they're doing, banding together to actually say, no, this is not okay, and we don't accept this. We don't want this to go to waste. These decades of experience and expertise globally that we've built up, why would we just throw that away? Why would we let the government just throw that away and stop funding it? So I think that kind of concerted and continued effort at not only a kind of national, federal lobbying level to the federal government, but also to state and territory governments, and even then at your local level, where I see schools advocating through their P&C committees to say, no, we don't want our school to drop Indonesian. This is incredibly inspiring. So to say that we've got this committed and concerted group of individuals across the country who doesn't want to let this go. I think that is a way of honouring the legacy and honouring the expertise that we've built up in this country. Well, Indonesia, but in Australia. Yeah.
No, very nicely put. And so I think you've really sort of come to the crux, isn't it? That the well, there's a lot of people who have an interest in this and who are sort of committed to the cause. So what's the bumper sticker message, I suppose, is my final question for you. What is the winning message that is going to appeal, or that we could, or one of them that we could use anyway? I'll ask that of you
Yes.
that we could.
Bumper sticker. I hadn't prepared this one. Bumper sticker message. Well, fund Asian studies would be a start, but that's not very sexy. So we'll have to think of something.
Hmm.
Um, I'm gonna have to get back. Can I get back to you on that one?
Please do, yeah, please
Find
do.
something nice and
I
succinct,
might
but
add this to the repertoire because I think
you
we're
know,
we're all scratching our heads. It's clearly out
yeah.
there, and we just haven't worked out what it is yet. But there must be something that can appeal to,
Mm,
well, those who have more say in it than us, anyway. But there's
yeah.
there's got to be something there, and I think we've got to start with something that can be expanded upon, and then rolled out in many different forms. So
Mm.
there's got to be something to unite
Well,
it, though.
yeah, even Asia, it's in our DNA. Australia, we're in Asia. I don't know. We need to have a whiteboard session on this
Yeah,
one.
I think that campaign has been lost. One it was fought
Yeah.
and lost a while ago, so maybe not. But I don't know, or maybe anyway. Look, that's beyond the remit that we've asked of you. You've given a lot of your time. I've really enjoyed the chance to talk to you today, Ellie.
Yeah,
Thanks for your
likewise.
thoughts,
Thank you, David.
and
Yeah.
I hope we can keep you engaged in ASAA in some form down the track.
Likewise, and always happy to help at ASAA. So thank you again for the invitation. Lovely to chat.
Thank you.